We're continuing our partnership with Learn Liberty today, and joining me is the Rudolph P. Lamone Chair and Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Maryland, as well as the Director for the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Economics, Rajshree Agarwal. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
I feel we're going to have a very good talk because we've already sort of had the interview before we started. We've been doing it already.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to this because we did meet once before. We were at a conference in DC that was sort of focusing on academia and free speech, and we spent a couple minutes talking. And what I thought was interesting, I don't think you knew who I was beforehand, and I didn't know who you were beforehand. And they sort of brought me there to talk a little bit about how YouTube plays a part in reaching young people and technology and all that. And you were very interested in that. Mm-hmm. So we didn't really focus on free speech together, but we focused on how technology is shifting the conversation. So just very quickly to start, why are you interested in how technology is affecting the conversation related to free speech, capitalism, the whole thing?
So I'm not interested in technology per se, but I'm interested in technology because it represents the manifestation of the human mind at work. Ultimately, what is technology? Technology is better machines. But what are machines ultimately? Whether they're fast computers or whether they're the industrialized age engines or whatever you call it, right? Mm-hmm. They are ways for us humans to make our lives easier by using machines. So technology ultimately is a way for humans to communicate better, to live better lives, and to use their mind in doing so.
Yeah.
So I study innovation, I study technology because it enables us to be the best we can be by using our mind.
I was very proud when you walked in here because mm-hmm. you study innovation and entrepreneurship, and this is my garage that we turned into a studio, so I thought,
yes,
she's gonna dig this.
And think about all of the creativity that went into it, right? Not just by you, but all of the techniques, the machines that we're looking around. It was someone's mind that had to come up with it first. So creativity, which is at the heart of individual enterprise, is what I love. Yeah. And that's what I study.
All right, so that's what we're going to spend most of this hour talking about.
Sure.
And you know, when we do these shows with Learn Liberty, they always send me just a quick one-page bio on everybody. And I really loved yours. There was a bunch of quotes in there that I want to quote directly to you. But
now you should know that when they asked me to write that bio, I dished that out in about 15 minutes at 4:30 in the morning.
Oh, look at you patting yourself on the back.
Well, no, I'm a morning person. That's all I'm saying to you.
Well, this was really good when you got here.
Yes.
But first, let's talk a little bit about your history because you have an interesting history. You were born in India mm-hmm. and you lived there for your first 21 years. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was born to a very, very traditional family. Hindu family. My father was your typical rags to riches entrepreneur. He embodied enterprise. And he, in fact, I'll tell you about this one story. I was in 5th grade and I came home so upset because the history lesson that I had just heard was all about how the United Kingdom, Britain, came in and just plundered this golden peacock that was India, and look at all of the nasty things that they did to us and how oppressed and victimized we were. And my father, who was very much a traditional Orthodox Hindu at that time, said, no, actually, Britain did more good for India than they did bad. And it's like, huh? What do you mean by that? And he went on to talk about why before that it's true that India was rich, but what did rich mean? It meant that the kings and the traders were rich, but there was a very feudalist economy at that time. And of course they were also very balkanized because each of these kingdoms were fighting with each other. So one of the things that he talked about is how the advent of the British, they bought the rule of law, they bought infrastructure, they gave us English as a language. Often people, my husband says, oh wow, you talk better English than I do. And it's like, yes, that's because I was educated in English as well.
Yeah.
But at the same time that he was such an entrepreneur in his mindset, he was very traditionalist in his views of how women should be. And so when I was 12 years old, he said to me, the right and the responsibility of finding a husband for you is mine. Don't you forget that. And of course, any woman in his family couldn't work because that was a slap on his face in his ability to provide for us. But if you think about it, at 12 years old, I'm being told that the two biggest decisions any individual can make for themselves, whom you marry and what you choose to work in. And I tell, I'd like to think that those two decisions undergird everything that we do, both at work and the not work life that we live. If those are taken away from you, what does that mean about you as an individual, you as a person? So between 12 and 18, I had to navigate that distance because at 12 years old, I was a daddy's girl. I said, of course, Dad, just please do me a favor, find me a husband who lives in Bombay because I can't even bear the thought of being in a city that's different from you. And at 18, I had to see for myself that I couldn't renege on that decision. So between 18 and 21 was really my discovery of who I wanted to be. And at 21, I left India, 2 suitcases in my hand, left everybody that I loved, a very generous inheritance. And my father did not speak to me for 7 years.
Wow. I mean, there's so much there of your formative stuff that leads you to where you're at right now. When you came home that day in 5th grade, you learned something in school, and then you hear something different from your father, who you obviously respected and admired and had, as you said, rags to riches, had provided a good life for you guys. How did you go back to school after that? I mean, did you go back and start arguing with teachers? Was that even a thing?
I was always arguing with teachers.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember my science teacher saying, Rajshree, why do you ask so many whys?
Pretty sure that's not what a science teacher is supposed to say.
That's right.
That's really fascinating. So you picked up and left.
Yes.
And left an inheritance, all this. You get to America. Just tell me a little bit about that initial experience. So
for me, this was freedom. It was, I had lived in India, especially in the generation that I was in. A girl or a woman did not live by themselves, right? They stayed with their parents till they were married, and then they went to their husband's house. So the concept of really being yourself and having the responsibility to make your own choices is both liberating, but then I also realized I can't blame my parents for my mistakes anymore. Indeed, 5 years later when my mom, or 6 years later when my mom came to visit with us, my husband said, what is the one biggest difference that you see in your daughter? And this will tell you a little bit about my personality there too. She says to him, she's become very responsible.
Wow, that's fascinating, actually.
And she uses this as evidence. She says, her father used to give her a very generous allowance, but we would marvel at the fact that this kid would go through this allowance within 10 or 12 days, and then she'd say, I'd like more. And then her father would sometimes give it and sometimes says, no, that's all you're gonna get. So then she'd come to me, or she'd come to her brother, or I started to tutor, because I often said I earned my own bread and butter, but my father provided me with the jam, right? But one of the things that she said was, now she looks at me and she realizes just how responsible I've become. That where before money would just flow off of my fingers and I wouldn't give it a second thought, I had become so much more responsible in my thinking. And I think she was talking a lot more about than just money. In India, I was rebelling because I was fighting against something. I came to the United States, I didn't have to fight against anything, so I had to figure out who I was and what I really wanted to be.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to thrive.
Yeah, so you mentioned you didn't talk to your father for 7 years after that.
Yes.
How did the reconciliation happen? Or was it a reconciliation?
It was a reconciliation. In fact, one of the things that I really, really treasure is, I was a daddy's girl. And I did want his approval. And after I got my PhD, I remember this one conversation that I had with him where I was this prodigal daughter. He was just finally talking to me again. I think he'd given up on the fact that I would be this person that would ultimately come home with my tail between my legs and say, you know, you were right, I was wrong. He'd just completely given up on that. And so he was listening to me, and of course I was trying to impress him. So I was talking to him about all of these achievements. As a young assistant professor, I'd received a couple of awards. I was getting to go to these prestigious conferences, and he's listening, but there's silence on his side. And the more I'm talking, the more he's silent. And then finally, I just gave up. I had nothing more to brag about or talk about, and I wasn't getting the "I'm so proud of you" from him. And so there was this uncomfortable silence, after which he says, it's a phrase in Hindi, which roughly translated says, if a peacock dances in a forest, who sees? So who cares? And his point to me was, you can be all of the peacock you are, but if you're not next to me, it doesn't mean anything. So that was the harshness that we started off with, even in the reconciliation. But my last visit with him, paradoxically, was when I was asked to give a keynote in India. This was immediately after India's liberalization. It was thriving as an economy that we now know it to be. And so I was asked to give a keynote at an academic conference on entrepreneurship and economic growth. And so on my way to this conference, I stopped by, and 10 years after I have done my PhD, I'm finally talking to my father about my research and connecting it to his own entrepreneurial spirit and him being a serial entrepreneur. And I can finally see the pride in his eyes.
So you got there.
I got there. And then at the keynote, at the end of this thing, when you go to India, you'll realize that when you give a speech, they'll give you a present. So in front of about 500 people, they give me this present that I open. And believe it or not, it's a peacock.
Seems fitting.
Seems, yes.
There's so much there, and it's so obvious hearing the story, how it led to all of the things that you're teaching about now and care about now. The concept between the battle between sort of traditionalism and then the entrepreneurial spirit is really a fascinating one, because he obviously had that. He built something for himself, built a good life, and then still wanted that piece of sort of the old world. And I think we all kind of struggle with that in a way.
I think
maybe
so
that's
too.
what the struggle of Western civilization is in some respects.
And I actually think that this relates to often the need to think and integrate one's psychological growth with one's growth in the material and in the riches realm. So one of the things that I think my father was as a paradox, unfortunately, and I think that caused him as well as me so much of this angst between us, is that at the same time that he applied his intellect into the economic realm, he psychologically did not necessarily realize that, you know, part of the reason he was successful is because he was able to make his own decisions, which also meant the freedom to make your own mistakes and learn from your mistakes. So while he allowed that there, as far as his family was concerned, there was this very protectionist, I need to take care of you. But that, I'm realizing this as a parent, is not very conducive to your children's growth, because what you really need to give them are the tools to make their own decisions, as opposed to telling them, you know, this is the way you should do it.
And ironically, had you not broken away and been free, although he may have been very pleased with your life, and who knows what your life would be, and maybe you would be happy in some ways, it wouldn't have led you to all this. So you had to directly
I had
that,
to do
which
that,
is interesting. So one more thing about India before we move on to everything else you're doing. I told you right before we started that I get a ton of fan mail from India. I think there's some really interesting political things happening right there that seem to be driving people to watching shows like this. Just give me one thing that we should know about India right now that maybe we don't know as Americans, which I think is probably everything, because India never comes up in the news really.
So I can talk about India right now a little less than I can talk about the India that I grew up in, and why growing up in India actually fostered my entrepreneurial spirit.
Okay, so we can do a little bit of that.
A little bit of that, right? And I think that that is one of the aspects. There's definitely selection at play, right? I do think that across every culture, people, individuals are born tabula rasa. Some cultures are much more conducive to having the entrepreneurial spirit bloom, and as a result, you see people go so much farther. But there are other cultures stifle it. But as individuals, I think we all have the same proclivity to be the persons that we can be. But one of the things that I will always credit in my education in India is the focus on thinking and critical thinking and intellectualism. So the concept of a nerd growing up for me was unheard of, because the coolest kids were also the ones that participated in science and elocution debates. You know, I was always at the forefront. I wasn't so much of a sports person, but I was very much in debates, in elocution competitions and science competitions and so on. And that was cool. That wasn't
like bizarro United States.
That's right. So the concept that there's a nerd and a nerd is socially awkward was unheard of for me. I'll give you another example. You know, my brother was the one that first talked to me about Ayn Rand. And of course, in that journey that I was telling you about, where I had to find my own identity, reading Atlas Shrugged was really the pillar of strength and helped me identify my own sense of life. But the way I read Atlas Shrugged, you'd find very funny, is in colleges in India, if you're a guy and you want to impress a chick, you carry, at least in my time, a paperback novel of Atlas Shrugged in your back pocket, because that means that you're thinking. Now, it was also said
that's so fascinating to me.
Right? And it's also said, well, if you're young, then you believe in these views, but then you grow up and you grow over it. I have never grown over it. I think that aspect of the mind, the ability to think through decisions, is one that I will credit the Indian culture and my father for endowing in me.
Yeah, well, you'll be happy to know, as I mentioned to you before, that I was at the Students for Liberty conference, and I met several students from India who were there that are involved with Ayn Rand Institute and that consider themselves objectivists and all that, and it seems that some of those ideas at least are thriving there. So that brings it into the modern day. Okay, so as I mentioned, I really loved your bio, and there were a couple of great quotes in there, so I want to read one directly to you. You said, "My passion is upward mobility integrated across intellectual, psychological, and economic realms. I care deeply about growth. Achievement for me is measured not by the level you have attained as much as the road you have traveled. For me, the journey is the destination, and I care deeply about integrity as in the whole of a person rather than the individual parts." And I thought, there's obviously a lot there, but it seems to me that this is sort of what we're missing these days. We've got people that are just screaming at each other all the time, that everyone's pretending they're an expert in everything, nobody's sort of listening. I've been traveling with Jordan Peterson a lot, who's talking so much about what I think is such simple stuff in a certain way, although he's quite brilliant at it, talking about personal responsibility and being a full person. And I thought that was really what you were getting to here.
Yes. So, what's the question?
So the question is, well, I guess I sort of know why you came to believe this, but we seem to have a real lack of an ability to be a full, integral person these days.
I think in part it really relates to this entrepreneurial mindset and a growth mindset. And for me personally, that is a perspective that is, in some sense, selfish. Let me explain what I mean by that. And I mean selfish in a very positive way here. I am right now an endowed professor. I'll just give you an example of it, right? And I get to mentor a lot of young minds. And many of them come to my office, particularly PhD students, with this mindset of, I know so much. It is true, I know a lot. But think about the interaction between a student and a professor. where if the professor says, I know everything, you're my student, and you're going to learn from me, it's a one-way street. It's the student benefiting from the professor with that mindset. But how is the professor benefiting from it? Where is my learning? Where is my growth? So in this conversation, one of the ways that I approach this relationship is I say, you have to start this conversation thinking of each other as intellectual equals. I may know more than you, but especially in the realm of research, which is creating new knowledge, I need you to have a questioning mind. Because what happens if you're saying something that I want to challenge? And after all, in academia, we're in the marketplace for ideas. If I challenge you and your mind immediately shuts down because you say, oh, Rajshree said this, she's the expert professor, she knows everything, and you're not going to challenge me, then you're not allowing yourself to learn. But more importantly, if I know that about you, I'm going to shut myself down. And I am going to censor myself from expressing my ideas because I want your mind to be open. So now we both lose, and we've both silenced ourselves. So this is just one example of where I think that this focus on growth and on learning is actually very liberating, and in that sense very selfish for me, because now it becomes a two-way street. I'm not just teaching, I'm also learning.
How do you get over the concept that selfishness is somehow evil? That I think a lot of people believe this. Inherently you say, well, I'm selfish, and they think, well, you're evil.
So this actually relates to one of this point about the lack of integration, or this thinking about either or. So the common concept of selfishness is as in, well, you're only thinking about yourself and not thinking about the other. Why? Why does it have to be an either or? Why cannot it be a win-win trade, which is fundamentally recognizing your dignity, my dignity, your identity, my identity, and knowledge that should we, right now you and I are talking. Why are we sitting here and having this conversation? Other than the fact, of course, that, we're passionate about these ideas.
Yeah.
And we find that our time together is meaningfully well spent. So my enjoyment out of this conversation is not at your expense. Neither is what you're gaining out of it at my expense. In fact, we're creating value together.
Yeah, I like that you brought it into this room, because that's exactly right. For me, at least, it's like, in a way, I'm doing something selfish in that I'm doing my show. I'm bringing a guest on that, will hopefully get people to watch, right? And you're here because you want your ideas to spread. The people that are watching this hopefully are getting something out of it for themselves. I mean, that's what people really need to understand, that that's what's integral about this. It doesn't mean we're taking from you. It actually means we're giving something to ourselves and something to you.
Yes. And so for me, this notion that selfishness means this brute that is just going to ride roughshod over everybody else's rights and responsibility fundamentally does not get to this idea that each of us have our right to live our lives the way we see best, and take the consequences, good or bad, of our decisions.
How much of this do you think is about just whether people view humans fundamentally as good or evil? So if you fundamentally think people are evil and you say to someone, be selfish, well, then it is that they're going to run roughshod over everybody and destroy the environment and steal money and kill people and all that, versus if you believe people are fundamentally good, or at least neutral, then if they do something for themselves, it will potentially be good for themselves and for other people.
So for me, the only evil is really the use of force to throttle somebody else. You can do what you want to do so long as you're not infringing on other people's rights and responsibilities and their ability to live their life the way they do. And indeed, in a civil society, that is the fundamental respect that we owe each other. That I live my life the best way that I think is done, but I'm not going to impose my views on you. I may have a conversation with you about my views, and you're free to agree or disagree with my views, and free to agree or to interact or not with me. But I can't force my views and my beliefs on you, and neither should you force. I mean, that's fundamentally the conversation between my father and I, if you think about it, right? It is that we were both very aligned in our views 80% of the time, but the 20% where he thought that as a father, he had the right to tell me what I should do, as opposed to be the facilitator and guide and advisor to my decisions. That is the fundamental disconnect.
Do you think we spend too much time on that 20%? Or, I think I heard Barry Weiss on Real Time call it the narcissism of small differences.
Yes.
Where we can agree on almost everything philosophically, and then we find something.
Yes.
And then that is what we focus on relentlessly.
And it really depends upon, is that something in a hierarchy of your values, a fundamental issue that you do need to disagree on? Or is that something in the hierarchy of your values and your beliefs, something that is not as critical to the conversation that we're having? So I prefer, indeed, I am a big believer in win-win outcomes. I don't, my husband is my best friend. I love him. The last thing I would want is for him to say, Rajshree, I'm with you. Not because it gives me any selfish joy, not because I get any pleasure. I take pity on you. I feel sorry for you. And that's why my life's objective is to take care of you. Would you want to be in that relationship? I'd walk out the door. I'd say, if I am not giving you personal satisfaction and joy in being with me, if I'm not your best friend just like you're mine, then this relationship is not a win-win.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be either an object of charity or pity, or I don't want you to feel like you're obligated.
Yeah. So I want to back up to something you said a few minutes ago about the way that you teach and that exchange between professor and student, where it's sort of you're trying to look at each other as equals, and I might learn something from them and they might learn something from me. So two parts on that. First off, how often do you find that you actually learn something?
Oh, every time. Indeed, last year, University of Maryland honored me with the Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award. And one of my first slides was about exactly that. The debt that I owe to my advisor, who incidentally gave me away when Rob and I got married. Remember, my father wasn't talking to me. My advisor was my second father. And so I learned a lot from him. And I have benefited from that learning of a mentor-advisee relationship, but I have benefited equally from paying it forward. So every one of my PhD students, I can pinpoint to you exactly what ideas they helped me learn, which empirical contexts and innovative industries I went into along with them, and how my own scholarship has fundamentally benefited and even changed trajectories because of my PhD students.
So the second part of that then would be, do you think that is a real rarity on college campuses these days, that professors are willing to learn from students? Because when I go to colleges, which I'm doing all the time now, one of the things I hear most is that students are actually afraid to challenge their professors because they think it's going to hurt their grades. And that generally, just generally speaking, this seems to come from more leftist professors, that if you challenge them on intersectionality or any of that, that people actually think their grades will suffer. Do you think that that's a broad problem in academia?
It is, unfortunately, there is this part of me in my soul that says that just cannot be true. Please let this not be true, because the fundamental identity of an academic should be one which is focused on learning and focused on ideas. And indeed, I would say that one requires a confidence and a self-esteem and to be comfortable with being challenged. And so often I do have several colleagues that I worry about, in as much as they don't make good advisors. And part of the reason they don't make good advisors is not because they are not experts in their sphere, but precisely because they cannot stand being challenged by their students. And in my opinion, that's a lose-lose. Not only are you stymieing the students' growth, you're stymieing your own growth.
Yeah. So when you hear people talking about the free speech issues on college campuses and at the conference that we were at, I mean, there were literally hundreds of professors there to talk about how do we defend free speech. That was the whole purpose of it. Do you sense that something has shifted in the last couple of years? Does it seem worse now?
I'll give you my own personal story. About 2 years ago, I ended up writing an op-ed in the Washington Post on confessions of a silenced professor. Now, you've heard me these last 15, 20 minutes. Anyone that knows me says, Rajshree, you silence? Give me a break.
You don't seem like the easily silenced guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And indeed, part of the theme of that op-ed was a very important self-realization that I had. And that was that I was now starting to think, do I really want to take this on? And it was a colleague of mine who, we were just having a conversation about something that had happened at a conference. And she said to me, and I was like, I'm wondering, should I weigh in on this or should I just let it go? And the point is not what the issue was. The point is that I even asked that question, which is what this colleague said to me. She says, Rajshree, when did you become so afraid of speaking your mind? And that really hit me in my gut, if you will. Yeah. It's like, when did I start thinking, if I do this, what's going to be the fallout within the academic circles? Should I repress myself? And that's when I realized that the spiral of silence, where we end up, so you can talk about censorship. I actually think at the University of Maryland, I am in a great university. Precedent on down, we have a investment and a dedication towards freedom of speech and thinking about the academia as a marketplace for ideas.
It's so great to hear. It's
It is
wonderful. Yeah.
I mean, just before I came here, I had a phenomenal conversation with the president regarding an event where we're worried about whether or not there is going to be some backlash because of some of the people that we're bringing in a debate. Mm-hmm. But for us, it's very important to have that reasoned and respectful discourse. But for me, it was, people from the outside can tell you whatever they want, but when you start to silence yourself, that's when you silence your mind. That's when you don't let your innovative creativity, because what is freedom of speech about? It is not the freedom to agree. It's the freedom to disagree. But doing so in a manner, and again, coming back to this use of force, right? Mm-hmm. I can say what I want. I am not, I in college campuses these days, one of the things that they say is, well, words can hurt. I was in a convent, and the teachers used to say, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words don't hurt me, right? Yeah. And yes, words do have a power. I'm not denying that. For sure, several of the things that my father said to me psychologically were very wounding, and I had to work through that. So I'm not denying the fact that words in the psychological and intellectual realm are very powerful. But the point is, there's a fundamental difference between words and coercion, as in now I am forcing you to think otherwise. Because words are fundamentally our minds thinking and then communicating with each other.
Yeah, we've had a long sort of slippery road on this, right? Where people are starting to think that words mean action, or that you have some sort of right to not be offended or a right to comfort. I mean, you just simply don't have those things.
I think actually it's the converse is true. You need to be courageous to look at something and say, this doesn't accord with my beliefs. So, let me use a different analogy out here. People often talk about open versus closed mind. I actually think neither of those concepts make sense. Because what is a closed mind? That is the professor that you and I were just talking about who says, I'm right, how dare you challenge me? I've made up my decisions already, right? But an open mind is someone that's just sitting on the fence, not willing to take any kind of a committed stand. In fact, I would prefer a closed mind to an open mind in that way, right? But what I really care about is an active mind. That I have some opinions, some beliefs, and they're based on the prior thinking that I have done. But I'm not omniscient. I'm not infallible. I could have made mistakes in my thinking. So having an active mind gives me the permission to say, I do have these thoughts and beliefs, but if someone provides me with compelling evidence and compelling logic that would make me change my thinking, then it is in my best interest to do so.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, I sit across brilliant people all the time, and every now and again someone drops something that I think, wow, that's what I've been trying to get to. Active mind. I mean, I'm going to start using that phrase because that's right. You don't just want an open mind of endless nothing, actually, and you don't want a closed mind, but an active mind. Keep working.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Yeah, so I want to ask you one other thing on
Yes.
this, and then I really want to focus on all the stuff that you're teaching
Yes.
For the whole second half.
Yes.
What do you think the actual solution is related to this? So if a professor like you has this sudden need or fear of self-censoring, and it's pretty obvious to me how open and courageous you are inherently, what do you think the solution is? And when we were at this conference, a lot of the professors were saying this has to come from the donors, because the administrators at the schools cannot be brave enough if they think that their jobs are on the line all the time, but that the one way to do it is that if the donors are slowly turning off the money to professors that won't defend free speech or administrators who won't back the professors who do, that might be the change. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and I disagree with it. Let me explain to you why I disagree with it. You cannot. So this comes back to the first question you asked me. Why do I focus on integrity? And why do I think about economics, which is money and donors, along with psychological and intellectual growth? For me, you cannot have one without the other. These are pieces of that fit together to make an integrated whole. Within academia, one always has to worry about the fact that you've got all of these pressures for conformity, pressures for funding and resources that are coming in there. What you really care about, and which you cannot renege if you are an intellectual entrepreneur, which is truly what being in academia is all about, being an intellectual entrepreneur, is your unwavering focus on knowledge, creating knowledge, and if I may say so, on truth. Resources, just like any venture capitalist, so this intellectual entrepreneur may be a good analogy actually. Venture capitalists provide you with the financial resources, but they are complementary resource providers. They cannot tell you which direction should you go, nor should they.
Right.
If you don't have that creative mindset, that intellectual horsepower, if you're not courageous enough to go for that, then any kind of pressure from the venture capitalists is not going to help, nor are any kind of pivots and directions and so on. So the way I look at it is, I do not and will not ever change my research based on what donors may or may not give. On the contrary, I will look for aligned donors. Because you cannot put the cart before the horse. You cannot put your purpose behind the money or the success metrics of your purpose. Your purpose has to drive all of the other resources that you garner. So if an administrator lacks courage, that's on the administrator first and foremost. If an academic lacks courage of conviction, that's on them. You can have complementary people aligned with you, kind of helping you along the way, but they cannot substitute for that fundamental drive that you need to have.